Most of us have longings inside of us that we're not willing to share with anyone else. Sometimes those longings are quiet and they hardly make any noise, and other times that same longing seems so important that it's almost as if it cannot be restrained. The older I am, the more I am just amazed at what people are willing to do to have their longings met. In fact, a person that's in debt is willing to chase all kinds of scams and do all kinds of deals in order to make it successfully financially. They want to just be rich. So sometimes people who are lonely are willing to hang out with people that will hurt them and people that are even willing to damage their soul just so they don't have to be alone. People who want to accomplish something significant and do something important with their life are willing to lie and cheat and steal and do almost anything in order to be able to be successful. As I was preparing for this sermon, I did some research on what 10 to 12-year-old kids really desire. I did some research on what it is that they really want, and surprised me. What they really want isn't to have great relationships. What they want isn't to be financially successful and have security. What they want is not to do something significant. What they want is to be famous. What they want is to be known. What they want to be is to be liked, to be seen, to be acknowledged. But what was more impressive to me and caught my attention was the reasons why 10 to 12-year-olds want to be successful. The first reason was they wanted to be seen. Fame would meet a desire so that they could be recognized in public. Some of them, it was a soothing escape from personal anxieties. Fame would help them along with their personal insecurities. Some people, it was to help them. Fame would give them the opportunities to make a difference and to become a role model, and some 10 to 12-year-olds were looking for status and a lifestyle. What they wanted to do was travel around the world in first class and go to any place they wanted and live in a really cool house and a mansion. We have an entire society that is promising us to fulfill our desires all the time. In fact, some of the smartest people in the planet stay up at night trying to figure out how they can sell us that their elusive product will take and meet the deepest longings of our soul. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of jaded. Whenever somebody promises something that is like way bigger than it sounds, there's something inside of me that says, if it's too good to be true, chances are it's probably too good to be true. Well, several years ago, this guy stopped by my house, and he was selling steaks out of the back of his van. He came up, knocked on the door, and I wasn't too impressed with him, and I wasn't interested in the steaks, but this guy was just so fun to talk to that I wanted to continue the conversation. So I followed him out to the truck, and he was willing to sell me 100 steaks for $700. And he started showing me tenderloins and then filet mignon, and none of that I had any interest in. But then he got to something that I had at least some interest in. It was prime rib. And once he showed me the prime rib, I was listening to his conversation. And he said that I'm willing, because it's the last stop of the day, to sell $700 worth of steaks for $92. And now he was speaking one of my languages. As anyone that knows me knows I'm super frugal. So he told me that because he really liked me, that he was willing to sell it to not anybody, but just to me for $41. I bought the steaks. But what shocked me and what surprised me was that the steaks were just as tender as he said they would be. The steaks were delightful, and they were really good, and for the next 6 months, we went out to the refrigerator, or the freezer, and then we were able to have meat for a long time for only $41. Here's what I want you to think about. Are some promises true? Do sometimes when people make outlandish promises, do those promises actually come true? How do you discern the difference between a scam and what is truthful? How do you determine when someone says something audacious and outrageous if they could back it up, or if it's just another promise that we should shove to the side because they're trying to sell us something? Can anyone be trusted to meet your deepest longings? A question that's even deeper is, can God be trusted with our deepest longings? Not a lot of people are told that God is interested in your longings. In fact, lots of believers and Christians and people that read the Bible tell people the opposite, that if it's a longing, if it's a desire, you should probably stuff it, and it's not that important. And the last person that would be interested in your real desires, the ones that you stay up at night, the deep longings that keep you captivated and make you do crazy stuff, are probably not best to be given to God. Some people are willing to do almost anything to meet those deep longings, those real ones. In fact, just to be known and just to be famous, did you know that 1 out of 12 people would disown their family? 1 out of 9 would give up on the ability to get married if they were widely known and became a household name. 1 out of 6 people would not even have children if they were to be successful on a grand scheme. The most interesting statistic I came across this week is that 6 out of 10 Yankee fans would be willing to cheer for the Boston Red Sox for an entire year if they got $20,000. I don't even want to know how many Vikings fans would be willing to become Packers fans for $20,000. We're not even going to talk about that. But the question I want you to think about before we move any further is, can God be trusted with your internal longings? I'm not talking about the surface level ones. I'm talking about the ones that scare you, about the ones that are underneath the surface, the ones that you truly want to have met. We're going to read out of John chapter 6, and if you have a Bible, I would love for you to turn to it. If you have your phone on the Bible app, that's a wonderful thing you can do. Turn to that as well. But before we get there, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork because John's gospel was different than all of the other gospels. John was an old man by the time he wrote his gospel, and he had taken some time. And he had reflected on the significance and the meaning of each of Jesus' words and all of the actual events that took place. And he had taken time so that he could sit with them long enough to be able to help us understand what they meant. And he gave us the details behind the surface, and he would constantly be allowing us to get the meaning of what was taking place. Start in John chapter 6, and here's what happened. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Jesus had been in the process of doing some incredible miracles. And John says that all of the miracles, all of the signs were given to us on purpose. Many other things Jesus did, but he recorded these specific ones so that people could take those signs and be able to believe and then have life in his name. In John 20, that's what he said the whole book was about. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover, that's the time when there would be a sacrificial lamb for the entire nation. It was at that time of season, and people would be thinking about Moses and about the law and about what they were required to do during that time. Verse 5, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, and the reason he chose Philip is because Philip was from Bethsaida, about 9 miles where this was taking place. It was an extremely remote place, and Jesus knew what he was about to do. He said this to all of his disciples, where should we get the bread to be able to feed all these people? Now, they're in a super remote place, and a massive crowd is coming in. And Jesus is trying to teach his disciples a lesson. He says, okay, guys, how are we going to feed them? And watch what happens. He asked them only to test them, and I want you to see this, that Jesus knew exactly what they were thinking. He knew their deepest longings and what was going on under the surface at every moment. He already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy even enough bread so that people could have one bite. There is no possible way you could pull this off. There are not a store around here. This is a remote place. And even if you had the money and had it catered, it would take more than a half a year's wages just so everybody could have a single bite. In essence, he's saying this could never happen. But John is letting us know that Jesus is not like anyone else. He has access to resources that no one else has access to, and this guy is different. He can accomplish things that nobody else can. Verse 8, another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far could they go among these people? He had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he said, this is all we can bring up from anybody, but it's not going to do any good. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass. I love John's just processing this. There was this one place where there was plenty of grass, and he said, have all the people sit down. There were about 5,000 men there. If you look at it in the Greek, and in Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's gospel, it says the word chorus, which means there was 5,000 men, not counting women and children. More than likely, there was around 15,000 people there. Now, just to give you an idea of how many people that is, if you were to take how many people would fit in this sanctuary and then times it by 25, that's about how many 15,000 people would be. They're in a remote place, and the disciples are saying, this could never happen. There's no way anything like this can take place. And the guy that knows about the local resources says, it is not going to happen. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those that were seated. Watch this. As much as they wanted. These were hungry people. These were people that had traveled quite a distance. Can you imagine how much food that would be? He did the same with the fish, and they all had enough. They were all satisfied with what they had to eat. And then Jesus is so smart, he says, let nothing be wasted. And then the disciples gathered up 12 baskets. And when you look at the word, it's not the word for baskets that's like this. It's the word for basket that's like this. And I can imagine them sitting around afterwards, all of them having a basket that they could barely carry, and them saying to themselves, what is it about this guy? He is different than anyone else. This guy has power to do stuff that nobody else ever has. After the people saw the signs performed, they began to say, surely this guy is a prophet coming into the world. And he's quoting Deuteronomy. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come to take him by force, Jesus knew what they were there for. He knew why they were there, and one of the reasons was they wanted freedom from the Roman oppressors, and they wanted Jesus to be their leader. I don't have time to go through the entire history of the Gospel of John, but I want to bring a few things to the forefront so that it'll make sense. John is telling them about certain specific signs, and he's laying each of these signs out, and each one, it tells a little bit about Jesus' character, about his mission, what it is he hopes to accomplish, and then he kind of slowly brings in the meaning. And he goes all the way back to chapter 2. We read this story where Jesus goes to this wedding, and he turns water into wine, and what he's letting us know is that Jesus had power over time. Later on, he goes to Canaan, and there's this boy in Capernaum, and Jesus is in Canaan, and even though he's in Canaan, he heals the guy in Capernaum, letting us know that he has power over space. Throughout the Gospel of John, there's three groups of people. There's the crowds, there's the disciples, and whenever you see the words for Jews, it's kind of code word for the religious elite, the ones that have power, and they're only coming with the intention to stick it to Jesus and to prove to him that he's wrong and has no business talking to people, or to have the audacity to take away their power. And whenever Jesus does a miracle in front of the Jews, the religious elite, he has a little bit of a desire to stick it to them. He's just a little bit where he likes to kind of stoke the fire a little bit and irritate people. And I don't know about you, but I kind of like to irritate some people, right? Some people just need to be pushed a little further. In the third miracle, Jesus intentionally healed an invalid, and he did it, but he brought him in front of all the Pharisees. Almost all of the things that he did just in front of his disciples, because he wasn't trying to prove he was awesome. He was trying to teach them a lesson. But this time, he brings them all the way in front of the religious people, and then he heals them, and he happened to do it on the Sabbath, and the only thing that they noticed was that the day of the week that it took place. This guy had been crippled his entire life, and now he could walk, and the only thing they cared about was that Jesus had violated the Sabbath. But in that, John wants everyone to know that Jesus has the power over tradition. In this one, when he multiplies the loaves and the fishes, he's allowing them to know that he has power over matter. And then in the rest of John, he shows them how he can walk on the water, and he helps everybody know that he has power over the forces of nature. We're not going to take time to read all of this in John's gospel, but if you keep reading in chapter 6, there's this massive storm, and it has fishermen terrified, and they're rowing like crazy to get across the sea, and after hour, they barely make it a little teeny distance, and then Jesus comes, walks on the water, they're terrified of him, and he just says, couple words, be still, and everything is calm. But what I want you to know is Jesus is not like anyone else. He has power over time and space and tradition and matter and the forces of nature. Why should you trust God with your deepest longings? He's not like anyone else. You see, so many people promise us to meet our deepest longings, but they don't have the power to back it up. They have the desire, they want to sell us stuff, but they don't have the power to come through. Not on the real ones, not on the things that actually matter, not on the ones that keep us awake at night, the ones that are so tender that we're not willing to share with anyone else. There is only one source to get those met. And Jesus was about to make one of the most audacious claims in the history of the world, and he was about to say he was the source that could meet people's deepest longings. And I want to ask us, why should we believe Jesus? Well, I think Jesus is not like anyone else. And that was John's message, that this guy has power over time and space and tradition and matter and the forces of nature. As we continue on in our story, I'm skipping all the way up to verse 25 because I only have 25 minutes to give you 72 verses, so that's why I'm talking so fast. When they found him on the other side of the lake, and I want you to kind of understand who the crowd is, okay? John wants you to know that these are not just the crowd. These are the people that showed up the next morning and tried to find Jesus, and they couldn't find him, so they got in the boat, and they went all the way to the other side. At first, there was probably 15,000 people, and now at the max, there's probably 50 to 100 people that are there. But these are the people that are really interested, that want to find out about Jesus. Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, and he says this, whenever you see very truthfully, it's not that he's trying to fill space. He's going to say something that's really important that we should probably pay attention to. Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because I performed the miracles, but because your bellies are full. The reason you're actually here is because you were satisfied and you got fed because you were hungry. Jesus is not like anyone else. He could discern what a person's true motive was and why they were actually there. What Jesus does now is just profound to me. He says, don't work for food that spoils, but I want you to work for food that endures all the way to eternal life. Jesus is going to do something interesting. And sometimes we can see it in other people, but we have a hard time doing it ourselves. Those of you that are parents, have you ever seen your kids where they're trying to get something they want, but they're going to end up getting something they don't really want? They're going to get something that they want in the moment. It's going to be immediate gratification and satisfaction, but it's going to cost them everything that they really want down the road. And what Jesus is saying, you guys are only here because you're hungry, but I want to offer you something that goes beyond this all the way into the future. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. For on him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval. I wish I could talk about how Jesus knew who he was and his identity and his purpose. He lived out of it in every moment. Everything he did was to please his Father. Then they asked him, what must we do and what does God require? And Jesus said that the works that God requires is to believe on the Son. The actual thing that you need to do is believe in Jesus. And they said, okay, we're willing to do this. We want that. What sign will you give? And I can imagine Jesus. Okay, here these people are. Okay, we're willing to listen to you, but first you got to prove yourself that you're not just like everyone else. And I can imagine Jesus saying, well, I turned water into wine. I healed a guy that was miles away when he wasn't even there. This other guy that had been crippled his entire life, I came up to him and I healed him on the Sabbath. I took and fed 15,000 people, and you were there and you watch it take place. And for my disciples, I even was able to calm that incredible storm last night that you saw all those lightning. I was there to be able to pull that off. But Jesus is so cool. Watch what he does. They ask him a question. Our ancestors ate manna. Remember, it was the time of Passover, and this would have been on everybody's mind. Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, verily, truly, I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. And in order for us to understand any of this, we have to think of bread differently. Okay, this is how people in our culture think of bread, okay? This is what we think. That stuff tastes good, but I don't want any of it. This is like carbohydrates that are going to go straight to my belly. Most of us are looking at it like, I am not eating the bread because it is not that important and I want to be able to fit into my pants. That's not how bread was, and that's not how it's been for most of the world for the last 4,000 years. Didn't you know for the last 4,000 years, for most of the world, and in still 65 to 70% of the world today, bread is the very essence of what will keep people alive. Because if you get bread, then you will get the one thing that you desire and the one thing that you need that will provide the source of everything that is truly important to them. And when Jesus is offering to be the bread of life, he is not saying that I'm going to give you this great diet. He's saying, I am going to be able to provide the primary source of sustenance that's going to go all the way into eternity. I love how cool Jesus is. Watch what he does here. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven. And remember, he's talking to people that are super interested in him. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. I can meet all of your deepest longings, not just for this lifetime, but all the way into the next. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and you still do not believe. All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. What he's saying is, I can provide you satisfaction not only for this lifetime, but all the way into the future. And the favorite part of it to me, because my dad left when I was a kid, is that I will never reject you. I will always be there with you. Sometimes when people read these words and they hear about Jesus promising to be the bread of life, that means that he is going to provide for every single need every time, the moment they ask him. Does that mean that if you ask God for something, you have him over the barrel and he has to give in to your whims and he has to meet all of your desires immediately, and if he doesn't meet those desires, then God hasn't kept up on what he promised to give you? Sometimes people are frustrated and disappointed and angry with God because they don't really understand what they're saying. I want to kind of help you a little bit. Most of us live for about 70 years. Some of us live for about 100. The ones that live the longest live to about 106. But Jesus is not only talking about 100, he's talking about 200, 500, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000, 100 million, 1 billion years. And what Jesus is promising is one of the most audacious claims that's ever been given. He is saying, I am the bread of life. I can provide your deepest longings, not just for this little teeny short lifetime, but all the way into eternity. And I want to highlight it in blue so you can catch how important it is what he's saying. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. Everything Jesus did was on purpose. And John is just going, wow, he was single-mindedly focused throughout his life. Verse 39, and this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of those, and he has given me, but I will raise them on the last day. You see, if you take what I'm offering, on that last day when I make everything right, you're going to be one of the people that get raised up at that moment. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him. I will raise you on that last day. Now, if this was a movie, the soundtrack would change, and all of a sudden you would have a little sinister music going on. And if you're not familiar with John and you haven't spent a lot of time with it, whenever John uses the word the Jews, he's talking about the religious elite, the ones that have already decided that Jesus is not the Messiah and he is a hindrance to them, and he's about to steal their money. Most of them are part of the Sanhedrin, the 70 that were in charge, and they were the ones that were there, and they were designed to confront Jesus and prove that he wasn't who he said. So Jesus often responded differently depending on the crowd. When the crowds were interested in, he was talking about how he's the bread of life. Now watch how he stokes them. Jesus is about to kind of push them a little bit, and he's going to get a little bit in their face. Something that's always interesting to me is Jesus started with 15,000, whittled it down to about maybe 100, and by the time he gets done giving the rest of the speech, he's left with 12 people, and he points out at the very end that one of these is going to betray him anyway, so he's not really following him. You see, Jesus wasn't interested in popularity. He wasn't interested in making sure everyone knew how great he was. In fact, if you start chapter 7 of John, he starts off with the disciples telling him, hey, Jesus, we got to show you how power works and how influence works, and you don't get it right because you give these speeches that drive people away, and you do miracles when no one's watching, and you need to make sure you know about the timing of the miracle. Jesus, you got incredible power, and you can do it. If you would just change your message a little teeny bit, and you would make sure the timing was there, then everyone would be amazed with you. But he wasn't impressed with any of that. And I want you to watch how Jesus is talking to this religious people because he is going to hammer them. They were single-mindedly focused on keeping the law. So what Jesus does is he quotes back to Leviticus chapter 17, and he is going to say some stuff that is so irritating to them that they're not going to be able to hear a word he says. So watch this. At this, the Jews there began to grumble. I could just imagine them in the background, just everybody's agitated and frustrated. Because he said, I am the bread of life, he was offering to be the primary substance that would be the permanent thing for what people's deepest longings are. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can this guy say this? So these guys are grumbling and talking to each other, and Jesus just silently says, stop grumbling, and watch what he does. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them on the last day. You know, before I move on, did you know some of you, God has been drawing you for a long time? God has been pursuing you, and he's been wooing you, and he's been wanting you to come to him. And if you're willing to do what Jesus is about to say, then you're going to get to experience life not only for this life, but eternity. But some of you have completely shut that off. And you're not willing to hear anything that Jesus says, and you're certainly not listening to me. You're hoping that this gets done soon. Very truly, remember I said whenever he said that, it's about to say something important? The one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, yet they died. Here's Jesus' point, okay? You say that Moses came and brought them the bread. It wasn't actually Moses. It was my Father who brought it to you. And those people who had the temporary sustenance, they stayed alive for a little while, they still died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. And as soon as he said that, he completely lost all the religious people because they knew Leviticus that said you cannot eat flesh. Jesus just takes it to another layer and irritates these people to no end. I would have loved to have watched that. I would have loved to sat there with them and watch Jesus go to this. Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And I think John helped us understand it because he took some time to reflect on it. But what he was doing was giving them a lesson in digestion. And what he was saying was that even if you eat bread and it doesn't go into your body, it's not going to keep it alive. And here's Jesus at the Passover, right before it takes place, telling them that he's about to go to the cross. And he's about to offer his body, and his body is going to be broken, and his blood is going to be shed. And that is going to be the way that you can be made right with God. And he's saying it in such a way that he's saying, unless you eat my flesh, unless it gets inside of you and it gets digested and becomes part of you, or unless you personalize it and internalize it and allow it to become part of you, then you're not going to get anything. And all they could hear was he started talking about flesh, and he said, this guy doesn't even know Leviticus 17. He is violating the law, and they missed everything Jesus said. I love how this ends. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. And this is really important. He said this while he was teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. And he's wanting to let everyone know that these words are spirit, they're life, but you have to get past the words to get to the meaning of what I'm trying to say. Why should you trust God with your deepest longings? Because he's the only one that actually has the power to fulfill them. He's the only one that has power over time and space and tradition and matter and the forces of nature. But the reason I would encourage you to follow Jesus, it's even more powerful than that, is that he's the only one that will help you meet the desires, the ones that you really want. All of us have longings for approval and affection and significance and security and for people to take delight in us. But Jesus, in the first of the 7 I ams, was offering to fulfill our deepest longings. And what I want to ask you to consider is, are you willing to turn those over to God? I'm not talking about for food. I'm not talking about for power. I'm talking about the kind that goes at the very recesses of your soul, the kind you don't talk about with anyone else. Are you willing to turn those over to God? Because Jesus promised that he could fulfill them and that he was the very most important thing we need, and he could fulfill our significant longings at the deepest recesses of our soul all the way to eternity. Why should you trust God with your longings? Because he's the only one that has the power to live them out. And he's the only one with the wisdom to help you fulfill the ones that you really want. Dear Heavenly Father, I know there's different people in here. And some of them are like the Jews, and they aren't listening to anything I'm saying. My prayer, God, is that you would break through with your tender, gentle love. God, there's other people that are confused like the crowd. And I pray, God, that they would continue to pursue so that they could experience something meaningful. And there's also those that are like the disciples, God. And they go on to say, this is a hard teaching. You mean, God, you want all of me, including the deepest, darkest desires of my soul? God, I pray that all of us would be able to experience who you really are, the one that cares about everything that's important to us. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen.